Hello and welcome to a very special conversation that I'm having with Mr. D. Subba Rao, former RBI governor, who's recently come out with a book, Just a Mercenary, Notes from My Life and Career. This talks about everything that one wants to know in terms of how bureaucrats deal with tough political bosses, which political bosses lend themselves to the difficult world of finance, or some would say the world of finance that doesn't come naturally to a lot of politicians who are susceptible to probably offering a lot many freebies or raveries, as they are now called in political discourse. How much of this impacts policy making? How much of that makes life tough for bureaucrats? And of course, who's the one political boss that every bureaucrat would like to have, especially when dealing with tough numbers related to fiscal math? Those are some of the questions that we will be putting forth to Mr. Subba Rao. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time and speaking to NDTV. My first question to you, sir, is what motivated you, what prompted you to write this book?
You know, I stepped down from the position of Governor of Reserve Bank of India in 2013. And then I wrote a book on my RBI experiences, which came out 3 years after I stepped down in 2016. That book, to my surprise, positive, pleasant surprise, found an audience much bigger than I expected. Lots of people, especially youngsters who read the book, said, "Sir, why don't you write a book on your IAS career?" I pushed back on that suggestion for many reasons, including the fact that I was not very confident that my story would be interesting. You know, civil service memoirs are a crowded genre. They span the entire spectrum. But the books that stood out are books by people who have interwoven their experience with the political and economic developments of that time. I was not sure my story can meet those exacting standards. Besides, I had not kept any notes. There was the challenge of jogging 50 years of memories. And there was always the risk that that jogging of memories, I would highlight my successes and hide my setbacks. So I was a bit skeptical, had misgivings, but eventually during the COVID lull, I started writing. And the COVID lull, in fact, was a motivation for writing the book. And indeed, all the youngsters who asked me to write the book were an indirect motivation for this book.
You've been candid in the book, and there's remarkable focus on details. Given that you're actually relying on just memory, then that's something that's very noteworthy, sir. But the book seems to be silent on some aspects of your very long and distinguished career in public life, which I would feel would be about things you could have done differently, things probably you wished you hadn't done, or some areas that I'm sure every bureaucrat must be, or every senior officer must be going through in his head. What about those aspects of your public life?
Some of those I reflected in the book. For example, things I could have done differently. Just to give one episode where I could have done differently was when I was Collector Khammam of district in Andhra Pradesh, in the combined Andhra Pradesh, in the early 1980s. I went headlong into implementing protective legislation for tribals, because tribals were a large chunk of Khammam population. Tribals were indebted. Many households were under bonded labor. They lost their lands. This, in spite of there being on statute books very strict protective legislation. So I said to myself, okay, my predecessors maybe had other priorities. I will implement this. So I went headlong into implementing it. And within 9 months, my tenure as collector of Khammam district aborted. I was transferred away. And then when I look back on my stint, I realized that maybe I should have done things differently. I should have, for example, planned it more carefully. I should have consulted my entire team. I should have motivated them. I should have prepared a more detailed action plan. Instead of doing that, by diving headlong into it, my concern or my regret is that probably in trying to win the battle, I lost the war. So that's one of the regrets I write about in the book.
So you've been the finance secretary of Andhra Pradesh, where you spent a lot of time. You've of course been the TA secretary. Then you moved on to be the RBI governor, sir. You understand how public finance really operates in India. There are competitive demands that take place, and you mentioned that as well. You get the opportunity of playing Santa once in a while, but the fact is everybody wants something out of a very limited and tight budget. Do you think many times politicians across political parties maybe do not understand just how easy it is to commit and how difficult it is to probably deliver?
No, I think they understand very well. I don't want to demean the understanding of politicians. In fact, I say somewhere in the book that they have a much better understanding of the ground situation than many civil servants. Give it to them. But the problem really is that they have political compulsions, which comes in the way of their doing what is economically right. So economic virtue is often thwarted by political virtue. They're in conflict. Take the example that you mentioned yourself of rave-deals, of freebies, or handouts. In the selection season, we're seeing that all parties, the BJP, the Congress, both national parties are into that game. All regional parties are into that game. And nobody is asking, where is the money for this coming from? And I believe there is a strong case for restraint, because these transfer payments, the freebies as they called in popular jargon, or rave-deals as the Prime Minister called them, are being financed by borrowing. And we know, even at a household level, or for a corporate, or even at the national level for a country, a loan has to repay itself by generating a future income stream. But if you just borrow and give it away to people as a transfer payment, you're not generating a revenue for that loan to be repaid. So all these loans will eventually catch up with you, and that has a cost, not just a fiscal cost, but even a public welfare cost.
This is the reason why I said that, do politicians, are they detached from delivery as against the kind of commitments they make? I mean, and we've already seen that, while right now, of course, is poll season, we've already seen the case of Karnataka, that the kind of subsidies and the kind of promises that were made, and when some of them had to be delivered, it had a terrible impact as far as the state's finances are concerned. The Deputy Chief Minister was on record saying, I don't have money for some of the demands that have been made.
That is true. That is true. But the question is, ultimately in a democracy, it's the people. So why are people not asking, where is the money for this going to come from? Why are politicians able to guarantee all this and get away with it? So ultimately, the people are the best defense against fiscally unsustainable decisions. So people are not asking because of many reasons. First of all, they don't understand the implications of these freebies. Like, if you borrow money and spend it on giving away, there is an opportunity cost. That money could be spent on education, on health, or on rural infrastructure. That cost is not being realized. So I believe there's a strong case for educating people, disseminating all this in a language and at a level they can understand the opportunity cost of these freebies, so that there is some consensus or at least more awareness on this.
How far do you think India is away from having such an informed electorate which asks its politicians of the day or netas who make demands that they are unsustainable? How far away are we from that? Or do you think we've reached that tipping point?
I think we're reaching a tipping point from a fiscal dimension. That debt of the central government probably getting under control now, but debt of state governments is getting quite high. What matters is the combined debt of the center and states for fiscal stability and therefore macroeconomic stability, and the debt to GDP ratio, which is one of the measures for assessing the debt sustainability, is quite high. So it's not so much when will people understand. I really can't put a finger on that, but what are we doing to make people understand this? That is more important.
That's a work in progress, and I hope that we get there sooner than some of the state finances that you mentioned deteriorate further. Now, you've spent a lot of time with different politicians. You've had a whole host of political bosses. Early on, when you were in Andhra Pradesh, of course, still you were the finance secretary and then RBI governor. Who was your one political boss with whom you had probably the best working relationship?
Well, I must say that I had good working relationship with all my political bosses. Of course, there were problems. There's no civil servant who has not had some sort of an issue with the politicians, but that's the way the world is, that's the way India is, and it is in the very nature of the system that the civil service and politicians have to work together, and politicians are the ultimate bosses. But I've had the privilege and opportunity of working with different political leaders. When I was collector, I worked with MLAs and MPs at the district level. When I was State Finance Secretary, I worked with the Chief Minister and the Finance Minister. When I was Finance Secretary in Delhi in Government of India, I worked with Finance Ministers and Prime Ministers here, and they were all varied. They came from different backgrounds, different academic preparation.
But whose political style, political acumen and policy making attitude you admired the most?
Well, I can't really admire, but the person, the politician I worked the longest with is Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, who was Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh for 5.5 years that I was Finance Secretary. And I found that he was an educated man, an enlightened politician, and had ideas that were ahead of his time, and good ideas, ideas for the larger public good that were ahead of his time. So I enjoyed and learned by working from him.
And what about one political boss with whom you had probably the most uneasy relationship? You mentioned some of that in the book, we'll come to that, but anybody else whom with you did not share a positive relationship with?
I can't identify a single politician, but when I was in the field as sub-collector, as collector, you interact with a lot of MLAs, and there are factions and there are political parties, and some of them are decent politicians, some are not so decent. So you have problems. I don't want to identify a single person or a single leader, and in fact I can't recall many of them. But I want to tell you this, which is that over time, over my 40-year career, both in the civil service and as Governor RBI, my respect for politicians has in fact gone up, for their understanding of the ground situation and for how they have to manage political compulsions. I have to say that.
Okay. Your book mentions that during your tenure as the RBI governor, and you of course demitted office in 2013, you shared an uneasy relationship with the then Finance Minister P. Chidambaram.
That is true. In fact, there were two finance ministers when I was governor. Mr. Chidambaram was the finance minister when I was appointed governor. Then Mr. Pranab Mukherjee was there for much of my tenure. And then towards the end of my tenure, Mr. Chidambaram had come back into the finance ministry. And it was an uneasy relationship, as you described it. And I talk about it in the book. Perhaps part of it is hardwired into the system. There are differences traditionally, historically, differences between the central bank and the government. It's not unique to India. We've seen these differences in other countries, in Japan, in the UK, in the US, in Turkey, and we've had differences. What is important is how you manage them. And that depends on the economic situation and also on the chemistry between the governor and the finance minister or the prime minister, as the case may be. So I had uneasy relationship, but ultimately looking back, it wasn't unhappy, certainly not.
What was the reason for this unease?
Well, the reason for this unease, as I said earlier, is that some differences between the government and central bank are hardwired into the system. Let me explain that in just a minute. The core mandate of a central bank, anywhere in the world, is to maintain financial stability and price stability. Delivering on this mandate requires the central bank to take a long-term view of the economy and many times take and implement decisions that might be painful in the short term. There is, as we all know, a tension between long-term sustainability and short-term compulsions. Politicians will be disinclined to take such hard decisions because their mind works on the election cycle, a short-term cycle. So you need a central bank to take a long-term view, and that's the reason central banks have come into existence at an arm's length to be a technocratic, apolitical body.
So what you're saying, sir, is that that time when Mr. P. Chidambaram was the finance minister, he was not in sync with the long-term view that you had about the economy, given that the election cycle was round the corner.
Well, I wouldn't so much say long-term cycle, but there was this conflict or tension between supporting growth and bringing down inflation. As all of you know, at a very broad level, bringing down inflation requires the central bank to raise interest rate, and sometimes in the short run, raising interest rate militates against growth. Mr. Chidambaram was very concerned about growth, and so there was that tension between the government and the central bank about the balance we must draw between supporting growth and curbing inflation. And in that way that balance should be drawn is where the differences were.
But isn't that infringing on the independence of RBI as an institution?
I wouldn't say straightforward that it is infringing on the independence of the central bank, because the central bank consults with all stakeholders before it takes a decision or a monetary policy view. It consults, for example, with banks, with markets, with non-bank finance companies, with economists, with academics. And it consults the government, because the government is also a big stakeholder. And there are differences of view. If the government says that this is our view and this is what we would like you to do, that's fair enough. But if the government goes beyond that to say that, look, unless you do this, it's going to be difficult for us, maybe that's uncomfortable. But if they say, no, unless you do this, it's going to be...
But some of the stakeholders who the RBI was in touch with, I'm sure the finance minister would also be knowing the views of all those stakeholders, right? So he knew what the ground realities were and what the view should be, given the fact that taming inflation is important. But in spite of that, if the government and the minister of the day that time felt that growth should have been prioritized, did he say that rates should be cut and growth should be the focus of the RBI? That is infringing on the institution's autonomy.
Well, I wouldn't say infringing on the autonomy, okay? I wouldn't go that far. But there were disagreements. And once in a while they came out in the open. But, I would call infringing on the autonomy of the central bank if they threatened the governor or removed the governor or issued a notice under the law to the central bank that you have to do this. Then I would say it's infringing on the autonomy of the central bank.
No, but sir, I would have said that would have been the collapse of the institution of RBI then. Maybe they didn't go that far, but the fact that there was disagreements which came out in the public does impact, or did it impact the functioning of RBI, and did it lead to a breakdown of communication between RBI and the government?
Not at all. There was never any breakdown between the RBI and the government in terms of communication. There was never an instance when the functioning of the central bank came to a stop because of government having a different view of macroeconomic management. I'm saying that there were differences, and we had differences. We agreed that we had differences. We agreed that we have different priorities because political leaders take, as I said, a short-term view of growth, and central bank is enjoined to take a long-term view. I wouldn't say that it's an infringement on the autonomy of the central bank. If indeed it is for the governor and the RBI as an institution to stand up for what they believe is the public good.
Okay, so I'm reading from the book Reserve Bank as the Government's Cheerleader, and you've written pressure by the government was not confined to the Reserve Bank's interest rate stance. On occasion, it extended to pressurizing the RBI to present rosier estimates of growth and inflation at variance with our objective assessment. If this is not infringement, sir, then what is?
I would say it is infringement if the central bank was forced or had no independence to take a different view. That wasn't the case. Okay, the government gave its point of view, pressured in some sense that you have to do this because the economy, this is required for the economy, for boosting the economy. So if the government said that, I would say it is infringing on the autonomy of the central bank if they said, unless you do this, we're going to issue a notice. That was never the
But
case.
sir, it also seems to indicate that they were in favor, they felt that rosier estimates of growth could be presented. Do you think that would have compromised credibility of Indian data? And is that something that government of the day can even think of doing? Did the finance minister even think of doing that, as you've mentioned here?
If the Reserve Bank actually acted and gave an estimate that was at variance with their objective assessment, that certainly would have been unprofessional and actually affected the credibility of the central bank. Okay, that is one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, I wouldn't say that there is a definitive estimate of growth. Okay, as we are seeing today also, they're different people. Different institutions, different individuals have their own estimates of growth. So you cannot always say that this is the estimate of growth and you're wrong. Okay? But the Reserve Bank, as an independent institution, serving a larger public good, has to stand by subjective assessment, which is what we did, and which is, I believe, what the central bank has done historically.
Okay, so it also says that Reserve Bank, I'll read the whole sentence. What upset me though was that almost seamlessly the discussion moved from objective arguments to subjective considerations with suggestions that the Reserve Bank must project a higher growth rate and a lower inflation rate in order to share responsibility with the government for quote unquote shoring up sentiment. This was the UPA which was on the back foot because of multiple scams that had come out, and in the backdrop of that it wanted RBI to shore up sentiment. That's completely against the law, spirit, and what the institution really stands for.
Well, I would say that it's, the backdrop, scams and all that you mentioned, but the backdrop, as I recall, and the backdrop as it was at that time was concern about stagflation. That we might be getting into a stagflation where growth was going down, inflation remained high. So both the government and the central bank must work together to not only arrest the economy from getting into a stagflation, but actually array concerns about the potential stagflation. That was the concern of the government, which I appreciated, but I could not agree with.
You also say that Ministry of Finance would seek a higher estimate for growth while simultaneously arguing for a softer stance on interest rate without seeing the obvious inconsistency between these two demands. You've mentioned the word and used the word demand, sir.
That's correct.
And which brings me to ask the question that they demanded a higher estimate of growth from RBI to shore up sentiment because there were these multitude of scams that had come out during the UPA era, and this is what they wanted the RBI governor of the day in 2013 wanted to do. How is it that you did not bow down to any of these demands? Tell us more about how is it that you stood your ground and restored and ensured that the RBI's autonomy and integrity remained.
I leave it to your interpretation of the context at that time, but once again I want to say was that the context was concern about stagflation, which was a shared concern of the government, of the Reserve Bank and of the larger public, certainly. So the entire discussion or the pressure or difference of opinion or cheerleading, the phrase I used, was in the context of arresting or preventing a stagflation and preventing worry about stagflation. And the way as I stood up to it was actually acting what I believe was the best judgment, objective judgment of the Reserve Bank of India. I listened to the government with due respect. I discussed with them. Sometimes it was an argument, a very professional argument. And then I did what I believe was the best in the larger public interest.
Absolutely, sir. And the fact that RBI as an institution has very strongly been able to withstand any political pressure that may come in is testimony to how you conducted yourself, sir, in the wake of those political demands that I mentioned here. And the reason why it's important for viewers to also know this is that 10 years later also the discourse right now is that there is now several experts from the Congress party, from the UPA, who feel that their growth rates, quote unquote, were higher than what the NDA growth rates are. Now, in the backdrop of this, you had Mr. G. Subba Rao explaining how then Finance Minister P. Chidambaram wanted to shore up sentiment, present rosier estimates, come up with higher growth rates than what the RBI felt was the actual economic scenario on the ground. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time and speaking to us about your tenure during your 3 years as the RBI governor. This is the book. Do read this in detail to know how is it that the push and pull works when bureaucrats have to be in tough positions to negotiate the demands of their job and, of course, of their political bosses as well. With that, it's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching this very special conversation.